Our YouTubers are back, of course, talking FF7. We're talking Remake Part 3 in this video, and we're talking about Square Enix's new plans going forward, switching to a multi-platform strategy, and whether or not that'll affect the game's release and or development. This is something that I've seen a little bit of discussion on, and I wanted to talk about it and make a video about it, but as often happens on the channel, it's something I want to talk about, and then there's something that kind of sparks me wanting to actually make the video. And this was Max, because Max put out a video, 4 or 5 days ago, talking about the move to multi-platform and stuff like that. But towards the end of his video, he actually talked about the move to multi-platform affecting Remake Part 3 and the game potentially being delayed, or at least dev time extended by half a year to a year, which I thought was kind of weird. I'll play a clip really quickly just for context's sake. It's like the last minute or so of his video.
Here's the thing that I am already going to be making an assumption about. The release windows for these games is going to be later now. I don't think we're getting FF7 Remake Part 3 in the same 3-year-ish time span that we were expecting. I don't think that's going to happen. And the reason that isn't happening is because its primary console of development is obviously PlayStation. It's going to remain that way, and then they effectively have to port it to the other systems as well as PC. Do I think it's going to be an astronomical amount of dev time? But I'm thinking, obviously 6 months to a year could have an impact in that way.
Yeah, I want to be clear too before we continue that this isn't like a response video to Max or whatever. I'm just giving my thoughts on what he said, but also on the subject in general. Now, the reason why I personally find that weird is that even if Remake Part 3, and I guess maybe the rest of the Remake trilogy, would come to other platforms that they've never been on, they won't matter at launch because the Remake project is PlayStation exclusive, right? And that'll be the same thing with Remake Part 3. They're not just going to, at launch, have Remake Part 3 coming out on PC or the new Switch or new Nintendo console, whatever the fuck it's going to be called, or the Xbox or whatever the fuck, right? It's still going to be exclusive to PS5 for however long. In fact, there's decent odds that the exclusive rights for Remake Part 3 were secured probably a long time ago. For one, we've known since the reveal back in 2015 that the Remake project was going to be multi-part, right? So it was going to come to PlayStation exclusively for however long. So it's possible that all the time back then, back in 2015, almost 10 years ago, that PlayStation paid Square Enix however much money or whatever for the game to be exclusive. Now, that might not be the case, but that's a possibility. But we've at least known that the Remake project was going to be a trilogy, confirmed at least, summer of 2022. So almost 2 years ago, which means behind the scenes is already decided however long before that announcement that it's going to be a trilogy, which I'd be very surprised if PlayStation wasn't in on that information before the actual announcement, right? So they're probably already securing the rights back then at maybe the absolute, most recent, the exclusive rights to Remake Part 3, if not as far back as 10 years ago, almost. And it's based off of what they did with Remake, right? That was announced back in 2015 to be an exclusive to PlayStation. That was years before the game came out. There was no window of time for release, right? We did have some gameplay shit towards the end of 2015, but obviously the game was kind of in development hell for a couple years, and they brought it in-house and then started showing it in 2019, released it in 2020. But that exclusive deal, exclusive contract, however you want to say that, was in motion years before the game was released. So I don't know how it works with these other games. I don't know exactly when they would decided that Part 2 Rebirth was going to be an exclusive. Maybe that was signed back in 2015 as well. I don't know. But in theory, these exclusive deals are made years before the game is ever going to come out. So again, if it's exclusive to PlayStation, why would the other platforms necessarily matter, at least at launch? Now that said, maybe they can come to some sort of agreement for Part 3 to kind of make the game more successful, make the trilogy more successful. They can come out on other platforms maybe. That's a possibility. Maybe they could rewrite the contract type shit where even though it's a PlayStation exclusive, it'll be on PC also at launch, and then maybe PlayStation gets some sort of small amount per sell type shit. I don't know. That's just an idea. I don't know the ins and outs of this stuff. It's possible that already is the case. I just don't entirely know how that works because the Remake games are obviously exclusive to the PlayStation platform, but they're not first-party games, right? But I imagine with first-party games that go to PC, PlayStation gets some sort of money from that. I just don't know how it would work with the Remake project. If maybe that is the case, then it could impact the release of the game to a certain degree, right? I'm not writing that off entirely, of course, because we don't exactly know what they're going to do. Because this is unprecedented, right? They have these exclusive games, but the plan going forward is a multi-platform strategy. We don't know what that's going to affect for games that are already kind of in development, right? We just don't know. A couple of smaller things that I think matter are, for one, we've already been told by Nomura, one of the main guys at Square Enix, that they're shooting for another 3-year time frame for the third part, just like with Rebirth. Because Rebirth, even though there was 4 years between Remake and Rebirth, a year was spent on making the DLC, as Nomura said. So realistically, they didn't start making Rebirth until 2021, so it only took them about 3 years to make the game. And it's going to be a similar thing for the third game. But on top of that, something I think is very important, even if it doesn't necessarily matter in terms of dev stuff, is that in 3 years is the 30th anniversary for FF7. And I'd be very, very fucking surprised if they'd miss that. Like the marketing writes itself, right? 30 years later, the conclusion to the remake trilogy. Like it's there. It writes itself easy. I don't necessarily mean that they're going to drop it on January 31st, 2027, though that of course is a possibility. They have had both games so far in the trilogy drop earlier in the year. They've technically been kind of working backwards other than the delay for Remake, right? It's initially March, then went to April. The Rebirth is February, so if we're still working backwards, that only leaves like earlier February or fucking January. And you get one opportunity to do this, right? You get one opportunity for a 30th anniversary, and there's something special about the game initially coming out on January 31st, 1997, and then all this time later, the trilogy concludes on January 31st, 2027. You can only do that one time. If it doesn't happen on January 31st, there's other release dates that took place in the year 1997, right? They could drop it, but the thing that matters is the year. Like, if it comes out in 2028, 31 years later, this doesn't sound as good. But kind of hopping back to what Max said, he mentioned anywhere from 6 months to a year, and if presumably Part 3 was coming out sometime early 2027, based on the 3-year time frame Nomura gave us, 6 months from then would still be within 2027. But it's the year thing where I'm like, I disagree, because I think it's coming out 100% sometime within 2027. It'd be, again, it just wouldn't make sense for them to skip that. But overall, those are just my thoughts, based on some opinions that I have, but also kind of facts in some ways, because we were told by the devs 3 years, told by Nomura 3 years. That's based on the Ultimania, which those interviews were done like I think a few months ago or something like that. And this is obviously a new landscape going forward for Square Enix, so that might change things, right? This whole moving to multi-platform shit. It could affect Part 3. I don't think it will, because this shit's kind of set in stone years ago with like exclusives, right? And unless they can come to some sort of agreement with PlayStation for the betterment of the remake project, it's a little too late if you ask me, because we're already in the last goddamn game. But if not, I imagine Part 3 would still be an exclusive to PS5 for 6 months to a year or whatever, and that's the priority, that release of the game. Even if they're going to make it for PC, even if they're going to make it for Switch 2, or maybe eventually, potentially Xbox, the priority is that initial version that's going to release to the public first. And I don't think they would necessarily impact that version to make these other versions, unless they're all coming out at the same time. Of course, that's where I pass off to you guys. What are your thoughts on this? Square Enix moving forward, wanting to do multi-platform. Is that going to impact Remake Part 3, or is that going to stick to being exclusive to the PS5 for a year or so? We kind of talked about this when we did the multi-platform video a few days ago, but I talked about it for maybe like 10 to 20 seconds, kind of speculating on the potential of them having it drop on other platforms at launch, mostly just PC. And then we kind of briefly touched on it, maybe coming to other platforms at a later point. Anyways, my dudes, that's the video. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Social networks in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, @DavidYT. That's it. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.